cartoonist, I'm an illustrator, and I'm an educator, and I've also worked in publishing, which is pretty much a long way of saying that when I get anxious, I make stuff. And one of the things that you're probably familiar with me for, if you're familiar with me at all, is this comic that I published that got around on the internet a few years back under various different names, like How I Learned to Love Being Aromantic, My Confessions of an Asexual, all that kind of thing, but which I just call Era. And you all got index cards when you came in, hopefully, and if you didn't, if you could come up now and grab some and a pencil, as many as you like. What I want you to do is I want you to doodle whatever you like, but one thing that I do want to make sure you doodle during this talk is a picture of yourself. And it doesn't have to look exactly like how you look in reality. It doesn't have to be really well drawn. It doesn't have to be like carefully drawn. You don't have to spend a lot of time on it. Just draw yourself as you feel comfortable imagining yourself looking. So one of the questions I'm going to ask you as you think about drawing yourself is, who are you? And that was a question I got asked a lot back when I was in the process of writing Arrow. When I was in the process of writing Arrow, I was attending a college for sequential art in the middle of nowhere in the whitest town in Vermont. And the way that our professors asked our minority peers, who are you, was a little bit different from the way that they asked the students that they could connect with more easily. The way that we were asked, who are you, was a lot more challenging than it was for students who were also white, who were also straight, who were also cis. The assumption, we were challenged more frequently on things that we took for granted as part of our lived experience and told that they were unrealistic and unnatural. Asked to change these things to make ourselves more relatable for an audience that didn't fundamentally relate to us. And one of the things we had to do that a lot of our peers didn't have to do was we had to spend our time at the school repackaging our identity to be marketable to an audience that didn't necessarily want to put in the legwork to understand us. So, this probably sounds familiar to a lot of you. If you live at the intersection of any minority, you're probably already extremely used to the process of explaining yourself to other people. Maybe you did it today, maybe you did it last week, maybe you refuse to do it anymore, in which case I congratulate you. But at one point in your life, you've definitely done it. And it's been easier, just because it was easier to explain a part of yourself that the person asking you has never had to examine about themselves, to move the conversation with them forward. And a lot of you probably know how dehumanizing and tiring that can be. For me, I was at the intersection of multiple identities, which made me harder to relate to emotionally. I'm an Asian woman, I'm an asexual woman, and I'm an aromantic woman, and those are all stereotypes that are associated with sort of like a lack of emotion, or like having less emotions, or having like emotions that are incomprehensible or even a little bit frightening to people. And one thing I found I had to do with my work was sort of make myself explainable to these people, make myself friendly to these people, and I found that my work had become less a tool to tell the stories I wanted to tell, and more a tool to explain myself to the people around me. So my challenge was to make a comic that sort of stopped the process of dehumanizing myself, but didn't turn my work into something that was the same as all those microaggressions and explanations I had to participate in every single day. A lot of the comics that I had been familiar with when I was coming to terms with my asexuality were very explainy, very diagrammatical comics with a lot of metaphors in them. And I'm sure that these were comics prompted by the same desire, to explain yourself, to make yourself less frightening to a group of people who don't necessarily find you to be easy to understand compared to the people around them. I certainly felt the pressure to make those kinds of comics, and I also felt the pressure to, spill my guts emotionally, to write out my pain and try to force people to see my perspective. But neither of those really felt true to who I was as a person or how I wanted to present myself in an ideal environment where I wasn't surrounded by that kind of pressure. And both of those felt very painful to like live out in the process of making my work, which I had always used as an escape from that sort of like need to be explained, that sort of like situation where I was always a minority. So I set out to make a comic that could use my real natural speaking voice and represent my real personality in a way that wasn't dehumanizing, and got this audience that was very resistant to understanding me on my own terms to listen to me. And the way that if you guys want to grab an index card and pencils, I can bring them to you.
Get my own pencils.
Environment where it was difficult for me to convey what I wanted to convey without compromising the way I wanted to present myself. And to make a comic that I felt accurately represented who I wanted to be and how I wanted to present myself, and to speak to these people who were putting pressure on me to define myself in certain ways and to do certain things and to be a certain kind of person, I had to use the language of comics to trick them into seeing me the way that I wanted to be seen, as someone who they were able to empathize with. And this is actually something I love telling my students who come to me to learn about comics, is that drawing comics is half admitting that you are a weaselly bastard. That you're willing to use any trick in the book to trick your audience into feeling the way that you want them to feel. So what I did was I went back and I started seriously studying autobio comics and slice of life comics and memoir comics from both the sort of genres of comics that I knew that these people were interested in and respected as capital L literature, and the type of comics that had made me come to love comics that they saw as niche, that they saw as genre, that they weren't really accepting of as part of the comics canon that they taught at the school. And trying to find a mixture of those that could both appeal to them and feel natural to me. So one of the things I'm going to talk about first when it comes to what I thought about when I was designing Arrow is something that's maybe a little bit unnatural to think about when you are writing a comic that comes entirely from real life. It's character design. And one thing that's important to realize about any autobio comic, even if it comes entirely from your real life, is that it is entirely populated with characters. Even if you're writing entirely from your real life, it's from your perspective, and you'll never be able to fully understand the thought processes that go into the actions of every person around you. You probably will never even fully be able to understand the thought processes that go into your own actions. And it's a cathartic process to try to unravel, but you're never really going to get that one-to-one veracity. You're always going to have a perspective on things, and you can't take that out of the equation. And the way that you depict the people around you, the way that you depict yourself, the way that you depict people from historical events, and the way that you depict the characters in your cast can cause your audience to see them a certain way before they even open their mouths to say anything. So first we're going to look at a very famous comic, and even if you're not familiar with comics, you've probably heard of this one. This is Art Spiegelman's Mouse. It's about the Holocaust, and it's a sort of series of interviews that Art Spiegelman conducted with his father, who was a survivor of the Holocaust, told into a story. And the way that Art Spiegelman uses character design is he portrays the Jewish people in his story as mice, and the German people as cats, to immediately sort of force a dichotomy where you are sympathetic to the Jewish people from a natural standpoint. You can understand the stakes just by looking at the character designs. This is the natural enemy of a mouse, and mice are associated with like prey. But it's also important to provide anonymity to Spiegelman, who is talking about some very serious family issues. He's talking about a very dark time in his family's past. You see a picture of him here with a mouse mask over his face as he talks about the stress and the pressure of writing this story. The stress and the pressure of it taking off and becoming like acclaimed as like the first sort of graphic novel that was taken seriously by the literary world, and like the reactions he got to this very personal story he was telling. And he very much hides behind the persona of a mouse to protect his feelings partially when he deals with the story. This was something that audiences had never seen before, and it provided a sense of dissonance for readers. Even if you had never read a comic before, you understood that this wasn't natural, this wasn't normal to see these funny animals that were associated with, like, Mickey Mouse being trotted across the worst human rights violation in the history of mankind. And this dissonance was something that Spiegelman used very successfully to get people to take mouse seriously right from the get-go, even if they weren't used to, like, taking drawings seriously, reading stories that involved, like, drawings to tell the narrative, even if they were used to only thinking of comics as, like, funny books for children. The sense of dissonance disrupted the reader's expectations right off the bat, and got them to gain a fresh perspective as they read this story about his family. This is a very different tone of comic, but this is James Kochaka's American Elf, which is a 14-year-long running diary script documenting the life of James Kochaka with snippets from his day-to-day existence, which explores like his family, it explores the people around him, it explores his inner thoughts, and he depicts himself as an elf to sort of portray like his whimsical outlook on life, and sort of portray his whimsical outlook on life without like having to dumb his story down for children. He's very much a character. And he makes it clear just from how he draws himself. He uses very simple lines and a very simple style to like sort of give you a sense of his personality before you even read the comic. But he also portrays the people around him as animals, partially to preserve their anonymity and partially to make you empathize with him as the main character of the story without even really having to read the rest of the comics in the series. You just look at it and he's the most human face you see, and you naturally empathize with him as the main character. The funny animal tradition is one that's been around in the West for a long time, and it's one that's been used for a lot of purposes, especially after Art Spiegelman's Mouse came out, to sort of illustrate a dissonance in like character design, to like project people's identities, to like sort of put a story in a different light, or like treat a serious subject in a way that could be depicted on the page without shocking too many viewers or like going too much into detail. And it was something I also used for Arrow. There were a couple of reasons for this, and one of them was that the audience I was writing for was not everyone sitting in this room, it was not everyone online, it was this very small community of people in this school who all knew me personally, and I didn't want them to read this comic and be asking themselves, is this what she really thinks of me? Who am I in this story? Am I this business cat? Am I this dog? Am I this bunny? I want them to just focus on what I had to say. And I also wanted to protect their identities. I didn't want to base any character too specifically on one person, because as everyone in this room probably knows, your privacy is a very important thing to protect. But I also made a conscious decision to make myself into a human character, to provide that extra level of empathy that I knew that I was missing when people were engaging with my work. To sort of force them to see me as the human character in this story, I sort of forced their hands to like acknowledge my humanity in a very direct way before they even started reading the story, whether or not they necessarily agreed with whether my sexuality was real, or whether I was really flirting with that guy at that party, or so on and so forth and so on and so forth. And I used that sleight of hand because I had to. I didn't really want to compromise my style and draw in a like more serious style that wasn't really something that I was comfortable with, just to make them take me seriously. Like I said before, I didn't want to have to change my voice to connect to these people in any way. So I wanted to use that dissonance as effectively as I could to try to preserve... Hi.
Hello.
Could you just take an index card and pencil, and I'd like you to draw a self-portrait of yourself? Yeah. because one of the comments I got about my style a lot was that it was very Disney, it was very cutesy, it was very romantic, that I was like someone who was supposed to be drawing love stories. I was someone who was supposed to be experiencing romantic feelings, because that was the kind of person they saw in my artwork. So another way I used dissonance when I was drawing Arrow is that I used all the tropes that were common in the romance comics that I had grown up with. I mentioned, like, I leaned into using shoujo tropes from, like, girls manga about falling in love and finding a boyfriend in high school and stuff to sort of emphasize the disconnect between what I was saying and, like, how people perceive me. I used flowers and sparkles, and I mentioned it. I mentioned how I leaned into reading that stuff growing up, and it became, the floral language became sort of a symbol of the, like, toxicity of that culture that I had grown up in and surrounded myself with, because I was a feminine girl, because I was cis, and because I had been presented with a sort of media for most of my life. I took inspiration from manga in other ways regarding character design, but I mostly took inspiration from more adult-oriented seinen and josei manga. And one of the major series that I took inspiration from was Goodnight Poon Poon. Goodnight Poon Poon is about a young boy named Poon Poon who is forced to navigate a sort of, like, baffling and heartless world of adults. And he is not very good at it, and he lives in a sort of abusive home with kind of neglectful parents, but he's doing his best to stay optimistic. And the longer the series progresses, the harder and harder that gets for Poon Poon to do. One thing that the manga author Asano Inio does with his character designs is that he does the opposite of what James Kolchaka does in American Elf. All of the other characters in Poon Poon are very, like, carefully rendered human figures. And Poon Poon is always drawn as a very simplistic, thick-lined, like, little bird scribble. And so are all the other members of his family. It's difficult to take him seriously at first, but as the story progresses, the way that Poon Poon's shape changes reflects his inner turmoil as he is faced with more and more complicated moral decisions. And he messes up, and he morally compromises himself, and he falls deeper and deeper into, like, emotional pit traps and, like, economical pit traps, and the way that he struggles starts to show through, and, like, just the way that he's portrayed on the page. And the reader is forced to confront how Poon Poon feels on every page. He's never really given a human face for the reader to identify with, so they're forced to sort of project their biases and their prejudices onto him. They're forced to constantly interpret how he's feeling by looking at what his face looks like on a certain panel. And to a much lesser extent, that was one thing I wanted to do in Arrow, because I wanted Arrow to stay a very simple story. I didn't want it to become too complicated. I didn't want it to become too revealing. I didn't want it to become too personal. And I didn't include that many backgrounds because I didn't want to give it much of a sense of place. I was writing for an audience that came from a very specific place. I had a very specific sense of place in mind, but I didn't want people to project on it too much. I made the conscious decision to do that, and as such, faces were the anchor point for the readers. So I dropped faces often when I was, like, reaching a point in the story where I wanted the reader to step back and think, where I wanted them to think twice about a certain scene and whether it was, like, really ringing true, where I wanted people to sort of just stop reading and blink for a moment, essentially. And especially during points where I was experiencing emotional turmoil, I wanted readers to pause and feel that emotional turmoil with me. So the places I chose to drop faces in Arrow were very intentional, and they were very sort of, like, personal to me. I was still writing for an audience that was very skeptical of me in various ways, and very skeptical of the kind of comics that I read, the kind of comics I enjoyed. They were not familiar with manga so much. They were not familiar with being aromantic, being asexual, or, like, and they were coming from a background where they were very white, and I wanted to make sure that my voice was preserved in talking to these people. One of the ways I did that was through panel layout. So we've talked about characters, but panel layout is sort of the punctuation of a comic. Like when you read a comics page, you probably, unless you have studied comics, don't really notice how the panel layout is going. You read one panel to the next panel, to the next panel, to the next panel. But every cartoonist puts a lot of thought into the way they lay out their panels, and the way they lay out their panels sort of decides how long a reader stays with a certain image, how long they feel a certain image, like whether or not they're going to turn the page. This is a page from Tintin, and Hergé is sort of a master laying out his panels. He's got a very specific layout. He doesn't often break the grid. This is very rote, but it's perfect for his kind of classic adventure stories. It's got a very measured beat, and then at the end of every page there's a cliffhanger that makes you want to turn the page yourself. Compare that to something like Winsor McCay's Little Nemo, which is about adventures through dreamland. And Winsor McCay often plays around with his panel layout to reflect sort of the surreal story that he's trying to tell that day. He and Hergé were sort of pioneers of the comics format. So often their readers didn't really know how to read comics that well. They had to stick to these sort of rote layouts, but they still managed to play with them in a way that tricked the reader into doing what they wanted, into feeling what they wanted. And the way they did that was by making sure that the comic page ended on the beat they wanted to end, that the panel layout stretched when they wanted the reader's imagination to stretch with them. And all of these invisible things led to a different reading experience. You see that the page from Tintin has a very different tone as the page from Little Nemo just by looking at it. It's got a different voice. Now, a lot of Western comics don't really break the panel grids, even if they're action comics, even if there's a lot going on the page. We see these rocks here are sort of flying off the page on impact, but that's about it. This is still very much like a rote. You can see the rows, columns, and gutters, whereas manga breaks the page all the time. And manga breaks the page to show action, but also to show emotion. And it involves a lot more beats that rest with the reader for longer. It involves a lot more space for the page to breathe, for the reader to breathe in an emotional moment. And often it can show an emotional moment without even showing its characters, and leaves a lot of space for you can you draw a portrait of yourself for me on this index card? Manga structures itself in such a way that even if the panel is taken out of context, you can still really feel sort of the emotions that were intended from that panel. You can feel the emotional resonance. And that was something that appealed to me a lot as a kid living at the intersection of a lot of identities that were hard to put into words, reading comics, and as an adult making comics who had to express a lot of things that I found to be difficult to put into words. So I started studying manga, but especially shoujo manga, because shoujo manga artists are really the masters of laying out the page in such a way that lends itself to the story. Without breaking the grid or without making their pages unreadable, they're a lot more experimental in delivering a page that shows the internal emotions of their characters. And sort of the whole anatomy of the page is more geared towards that rather than delivering the story to you in a very rote way. Shoujo manga also has some of the most innovative panel layouts when it comes to giving characters a moment to breathe or to express their emotions in a story. There's a lot more room to pause and take in a suspenseful moment that leaves an impact on the character's psyche rather than a fight scene or an action scene. And a lot of what shoujo manga focuses on is finding emotional catharsis. So, ironically, as I wrote this story about being aromantic, I was cribbing heavily from the layouts of romance comics. But what Arrow was intended to be didn't necessarily clash with that. It was meant to be sort of a love story about coming to accept and love yourself. And that was the language of comics that I had been familiar with. That was the language of comics I knew how to express that feeling in, that feeling of finding emotional catharsis. So there was a lot of focus on little gestures. There was a lot of focus on like little moments, and there was a lot of focus on keeping panel layouts open, on like dropping panel borders whenever possible. And this was something that didn't survive in the digital, sort of digital copies of Arrow. The way that this was supposed to look was to give the reader a lot of instances where the action simply floated off the page, where it kept a sense of openness rather than being confined by panel borders, to give the reader room to breathe. And often, like, I even dropped, like, whole backgrounds, entire pieces of art, just to, like, leave the impact of a moment longer with someone, because I was more concerned about delivering that emotional punch. When I thought about being aromantic, when I thought about being asexual, about what I wanted to convey with this comic, I definitely, though there is a place for those very helpful explanatory comics about how to deal with asexual and aromantic people and how to understand them, I didn't want this to be that. I felt that there was a lot more resistance towards the idea of being aromantic and not being able to feel romantic feelings than there was necessarily for being asexual. I had certainly experienced a lot more resistance to the idea that I might be aromantic myself when I was coming to terms with my identity, precisely because of that fear that that felt unnatural, because there was more cultural build-up against the idea that there isn't someone necessarily just for you out there, that you don't need to find romance, that you don't need to pursue it. So I wanted Arrow to be an emotional journey, even if the reader didn't necessarily understand it, and I didn't want it to be something that people outside of that experience would necessarily find to be easy to comprehend. I chose the title Arrow fairly intentionally because I didn't want it to be something that people who weren't familiar with the idea of aromanticism to necessarily be able to grasp. And the cover that I chose, which was this sort of scary horror cover, wasn't supposed to be something that explained anything at all to the viewer to help them understand the title. If the viewer wanted to go in and read it, and if they didn't necessarily understand it, that was on them. I wanted them to feel the emotional texture of what I was saying before they necessarily understood the actual weight of it, before they actually understood the facts about aromanticism. I had been explaining things for 2 years over and over again every single day, and essentially I was fed up. So a lot of the language of flowers comes from shoujo manga, but also sort of from the idea that I think especially that feminine presenting people must find romance. I feel there's a lot more intense pressure in the media aimed towards feminine presenting people to that's your end game, that's your happy ending, that's your goal. So I also wanted to, as someone who had been very pressured to be feminine my whole life, very steeped in that sort of culture, make something that if I was a reader and not the author, that I would find to be relatable without being involved in that sort of message that I had to keep running on that hamster wheel. So, to get ready for writing Arrow, I wrote a bunch of other autobiographical comics, testing different tones, different voices, and different styles of comic, trying to figure out what suited my message best. This is from the shortest of them, which is a 4-page comic called Keeping, and it's about the cycles of abuse. There are only 2 lines of dialogue in the whole comic, and they both say the same thing. They both say, "This is your home now," as the main character is forced into a lonely house on the hill, and then says the same thing at the end of the comic to a jellyfish that she finds in the water. It's about the fear that you will become like people who have hurt you, and it definitely disrupted my audience's expectations for me, but I found that people who were less familiar with this type of experience were more likely to read it as optimistic or misinterpret it. So I ended up not pursuing that line of inquiry and changing tactics. And the next tactic I tried was to do something that was a lot more similar to existing autobio comics that come from Western cartoonist point of view. I tried making a sort of funny comics talking about the burnout I was currently experiencing in my school, like doing everything that was assigned to me, doing all the work I had on top of that, and then explaining myself over and over again and recontextualizing myself. And trying to package this in a funny way, I presented the main character as sort of like this gremlin girl who's just trying to struggle her way through life. And she was very relatable to the audience. She was definitely the most beloved of all the characters that I tried, but she wasn't very good at causing the audience to empathize with her. So my last sort of experiment was what I ended up sort of favoring in tone when I decided to write Arrow, was a comic about living life at the low end of a sort of depressive episode. And it played a lot more with panel layouts, it played a lot more with like breaking the grid, and it played a lot more with breaking the grid to deliver an emotional experience that not all of the audience would necessarily be able to relate to. It was still pretty explainy, but it was definitely something that my audience was more immediately sympathetic to and more latched onto more readily as like something that they were willing to humanize me for, something that they were willing to see as relatable. And so that was what I decided to do when I decided to write Arrow, while still going back and like mixing some of the humor from the earlier comics and some of the sort of ways that I played with character design to unsettle people from keeping. Arrow was definitely my most successful autobiographical comic, and I think it was the only one where I really nailed what I was trying to go for and the message I was trying to deliver. But it was also definitely too little too late. By the time that Arrow got published, I was in trauma therapy for PTSD. And the last comic I sort of wrote was a comic addressing the faculty of my school called The Garden of Unspeakable Things, which was a series of self-portraits during my time in trauma therapy. And the first and last self-portrait were written very much like what you have in front of you. They were written on blank index cards, forcing these very small intended audience to pull out the index cards at the beginning and end and deal with that part of the story personally. Since Arrow was published, but I was no longer able to make comics, and Arrow was out there and sort of like in the role of speaking for me for a long time. And what happened was a lot of people started sending me emails asking me whether or not they thought they were aromantic, saying that this was the first thing they found when they Googled whether or not they might be aromantic. I got a lot of people asking me for my thoughts on very personal parts of their lives and reaching out to me because they had found my work. And that wasn't really what I had set out to do. That was definitely something that I tried to be open to and be as helpful as I could, but I don't really think I'm a model aromantic person, and I don't necessarily think that Arrow is like the be-all, end-all of aromantic comics. I was glad that it resonated with people, though, because I understand definitely the power that a story that speaks to you instead of about you has, that a story that acknowledges you has, and that a story that acknowledges you gives you power, even if just for a moment. And that was, I think, Arrow's maybe greatest and only success, is to give people around me who are experiencing similar things to me the power to speak out and acknowledge that about themselves and reach out to me as well. It's a difficult thing to make yourself be seen, and it's a difficult thing to choose how to present yourself when you decide that you want to be seen by others. So I'd like you right now to look at the index cards at the self-portraits you drew. And I'd like to ask yourself, do I like this person? Do I know them? What do I want to say to them? And what do I want to say about them? I'm Kotaline Jones, and who are you? So if anyone has any question and answer session right now, definitely, if we have any time for that, I'd be happy to do that. I don't actually know what the time is. Oh yeah, so does anyone have any questions they want to ask me about, like, the process of getting Arrow published, about any questions they have about making their own comics or, like, making their own stories?
I can't draw to save my life, but I am interested in learning about the comic book format and possibly writing a book with an artist one day.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how I can reach out to artists and learn how to collaborate with them.
So definitely the first thing you'll want to keep in mind with most artists is that they do this for a job. So thinking about what kind of page rates you can afford when you reach out to an artist and, like, reaching them right away with, like, this is a professional offer, this is how much I'm willing to pay you for your time. And seeing whether you work well together is important, but first and foremost, letting them know that you're serious about working with them is the primary thing. Also, you don't need to draw comics. You just need to know how to convey a scene well. Like, even if you just draw stick figures, as long as your story is important to you and you tell it powerfully, that's what matters. Yeah.
Since I was trying to be in two places at the same time, I missed. Is the name of the comic Arrow? Because you were saying that.
Yeah, it is Arrow.
Okay.
It was published under a lot of different titles to make it more appealing to an audience when it got published online. That was largely a decision of the editors who decided to publish it. So you might have seen it as, like, How I Learned to Love Being a Romantic or some other, like, clickbait title. Yeah.
I have always liked writing and stories and character worlds.
Do you mind if I just step up close so I can hear?
No problem. But one of the things I struggle with, and I know this is more autobiographical for you, but if it's not so much that, like, when you want to put in some kind of conflict and drama in your story and you relate a lot to the characters, like, how do you get across, not, like, wanting to hurt them in a way, you know what I mean?
Wanting to hurt them?
Like, you don't want to, no, like, you want things to go well, but you also want to have the story be compelling, and you're like, it's hard to kind of put those two things together sometimes when you're really into your story and characters.
Definitely. I think you have to respect the consequences of the actions that you put them through in the plot. Like, if a character loses an arm, you have to be ready to address the narrative conflicts that come up because of that in a way that isn't flippant. You have to address the recovery in a way it impacts their psyche to deal with, like, suddenly losing them in a way that doesn't treat the reader like they're stupid. There's no instant fix for things. There's no, like, magic bullet. Just, like, write a story that's empathetic to your character who's going through everything you're putting them through, and, like, respect that they will react to the story, and don't just, like, downplay or minimize their reactions for the sake of moving the story forward. Yeah.
Did you write the comic first and then seek someone to publish it, or did you?
I wrote the comic first and put it out on, I think, Asexual Day of Visibility, and for free online on my own website. And then I was contacted by people who wanted to publish it on their platform and other platforms and boost it on those platforms. I have never intended to make money off of Arrow, and I definitely, when I made it, I didn't really imagine, like, going out and being like, hey, I want to get this published. It was that platform, I was lucky enough to have a platform be offered to me, and I accepted that offer because I did want to reach more people if people thought that it was worth reading.
Did you have to make any concessions aside from what it's called?
That was the only concession I had to make, but you should always read the contract before you sign it. One thing that I did ask them to renegotiate, it was just part of their boilerplate contract. It wasn't something that they were gunning for. I didn't want them to keep the rights to Arrow. I wanted the rights to expire after a certain number of months and revert back to me. They only had republishing rights for, I think, maybe 6 months, and then I had complete control over it again. Yeah.
Have you only published comic? Because I'm just wondering the difference between writing a standard autobiography book versus a comic.
Yeah, I've only published comics. I do prose writing as well, but that's not my primary interest. The difference between writing prose and writing comics, I've worked in comics publishing, and it's not really that different on the publishing end. It's more different on the artist and author's end, like whether or not you're going to be working with someone, if you're working on your own, like how you're going to incorporate the visual aspects with the dialogue, and like how you're going to manage the real estate of the page well, because you have way less space than you would in a piece of prose writing to deliver like the emotional message of your story. Like in a piece of prose writing, if someone slapped my arm right now, I could be like, I was taken aback, I was shocked, it stung, but I can only show that in comics through like very certain visual images, and I can't really dwell on like what's going on in my mind in a way that is literal and like conveys itself to the reader. Did that answer your question?
It did.
Okay, yeah.
Anyone has any questions in the back? I was just wondering if you've seen any other comics that touched on asexuality or aromanticism that you enjoyed, I guess, personally.
That I enjoy. Unfortunately, I am not super involved in comics right now because I'm recovering from PTSD. But as far as comics that touched on personal matters in general that I enjoyed, there was one that I was really sad I couldn't manage to include in this presentation that did actually really help me figure out the tone of Arrow, and it was called Get Over It by Corinne Mucha, and it was about her experience after a breakup of a relationship after a long relationship, which she thought was going to end well, sort of end with her quote-unquote happy ending. And the way that she describes like the emotional process of like coming to terms with something that she thought would be there that isn't anymore is very similar to how I sort of like decided to go through coming to terms with the processes of looking inside myself and realizing that something that I thought was there was not there. And I think that's one of the biggest problems about like writing about asexuality and aromanticism in general is like writing about the absence of a thing, and just like finding a way to make that absence of a thing compelling to someone who has never really caused themselves to question whether or not they have that, or like whether or not it's there, and who has always been like conditioned to believe that of course it is.
If you don't mind, there's this metaphor that's useful for me in describing like this thing to other people. So, anyone here familiar with the silent disco? Like when people wear headphones, dancing to music with you. So basically, what I see with asexual or like non-asexual or allosexual people or romantic people is that they're all listening to this thing that you can't hear, and you're looking at these people like supposedly dancing in silence, and you're wondering what the heck's going on, and it's like you're standing outside the circle or something like that, or you're tuned into a different frequency.
Yeah, and definitely I think that again those metaphors were very helpful to me in coming to terms with like defining what labels fit me. But when I tried to use them in turn to like get other people to believe me, I found that people outside of that experience weren't really sold on the sort of emotional legwork of convincing them that what I was saying was true, which was something that Arrow tried to address, and I think that definitely one of the worst moments after Arrow got published, and one of the most reaffirming moments, was that I got a text from one of the people who had been most resistant to the idea that I was aromantic, saying, "Oh, I believe you now." It's like, great, I am so glad. But yeah, anyone else have any other questions? Yeah, do you mind if I come a little closer so I can hear better? Yeah.
I'm just wondering, so when you were writing Arrow, so it's autobiographical comic, and it's also kind of fictional, and how did you consider about including the diversity within this community? Like when you're writing a character
So it was very, it was a crucible, was what it was, and the way that I dealt with writing a comic in that crucible about these people who were all the main characters of their own very separate, intense personal dramas was I tried not to focus on it. I tried to focus specifically on conveying my own emotional state, and I tried to figure if they wanted to project themselves on characters they could, but I wouldn't worry about what they thought. What I did though was I scripted Arrow before I wrote it. I wrote a script and I took it around to a lot of my classmates that came from different backgrounds, some of whom didn't really believe I was aromantic or asexual, some of whom were sort of on my side or in my corner and believed me all along, and also to people outside of that community, like other asexual people I knew, and I asked them to read it, and I asked them, does this seem like it's conveying what I want to convey? Does this seem like it's at all like disrespectful to, or like, does it sound like it's trying to speak for all aromantic people, or does it sound like it's a personal experience to me? And what I wanted was to capture that personal experience to me without worrying about outside concerns. Any other questions? Five more minutes. But yeah. It's always a little bit, this is the first time I've really talked to anyone who has been familiar with this sort of experience since I wrote Arrow. I did get a lot of email about it from people who were questioning whether or not they were aromantic, and because of my PTSD, I was only able to answer the ones who were like, do you think I might be aromantic? I was like, hold on for a second. Don't email a stranger and ask them for their opinion. But respect yourself. And that was definitely new for me. I'm a very private person. And I don't really talk a lot to strangers, so to have people be like, what direction do you think my life should go in? It's like, oh. There was this one email I got was like, do you think I should break up with my boyfriend? I was like, oh my god. And for that one, I was like, well, if you're emailing a stranger asking if you should break up with your boyfriend, whether or not you're aromantic, I think you should re-examine like how you feel about him. But definitely, it's the experience of putting yourself out there has definitely been overall a positive one for me, I think. I do have PTSD now from unavoidable circumstances, and it does affect my day-to-day life. It does affect how I produce comics and how I produce stories and how I think about stories as well. But I don't regret writing Arrow, and I feel like ultimately if I hadn't written Arrow, my experience with PTSD would be worse than it has been. And I wish I could end this happily by saying, and now I'm cured and everything is great and I'm working on a graphic novel, but no, that's not the case. But thank you all for being here with me, and it's been nice to have you listen, and I hope that by listening you have ideas for your own stories, because one thing I always hear about in all of these emails I get about Arrow is that I wish there were more stories like these.